Bom dia, então, a todos e todas. Vamos dar início a essa nossa manhã, onde ouviremos David Harvey. O evento é uma realização da editora Boitempo e da PUC-Rio, através do Decanato de Teologia e Ciências Humanas, mais especificamente do Instituto de Estudos Avançados e Humanidades e do Programa de Mestrado em Arquitetura. David Harvey dispensa apresentações. Todos que estamos aqui conhecemos sua trajetória e pensamento. O geógrafo britânico David Harvey é um dos pensadores mais influentes da atualidade. Unindo geografia urbana, marxismo e filosofia social na compreensão das contradições do mundo contemporâneo, sua obra é um forte eixo de renovação da tradição crítica e ganha especial relevância no contexto de explosão de movimentos contestatórios urbanos no Brasil e no mundo. Estamos aqui para ouvi-lo e, por isso, não vou me alongar mais. Antes de passar a palavra aqui da editora Boitempo, que dirá também algumas palavras, saúde de modo especial aos professores e alunos da PUC-Rio aqui presentes. Obrigado, Kim.
Bom dia a todos. Temos o maior prazer de estar aqui com vocês nessa conferência. David Harvey começou a ser lançado seus livros pela Boitempo no ano passado, com o livro Enigma do Capital. De lá para cá, a gente publicou também artigos dele nos livros da coleção Tinta Vermelha Occupy e Cidades Rebeldes, assim como o livro Para Entender o Capital, livro 1, sobre o livro 1 do Capital de Marx. E agora vem ao Brasil uma vez mais no contexto do lançamento de um livro publicado originalmente na década de 80, chamado Os Limites do Capital. Esse livro é uma obra completamente obrigatória, absurdamente atual, e o Harvey é uma pessoa extremamente generosa, com uma oratória, como vocês devem conhecer ou conhecerão, incrível. De tal forma que vamos prosseguir agora com uma conferência de aproximadamente 1 hora e meia, seguida de questões. As questões serão feitas por escrito, então eu peço a todos que quiserem enviar questões aqui para a mesa, que levantem a mão e a equipe do teatro vai recolher as questões durante a conferência e também, ao fim da conferência, vai ter um tempo ainda para recolher mais questões. A gente vai agrupar todas tematicamente para poder render o máximo possível, representando democraticamente as questões levantadas por vocês. Então, sem mais acrescentar, vamos passar para a conferência do Harvey. Queria agradecer também a parceria com a PUC e a apresentação do Paulo.
Em cada mesa vocês têm papéis, né, onde vão poder, então, escrever as perguntas, que depois serão recolhidas pela equipe do decanato e trazidas aqui.
Então, David.
Okay, well, thank you first to the Catholic University for staging this, and of course to Boitempo for being such a fantastic publisher. I've enjoyed immensely working with them personally and intellectually, and so it's a very great pleasure for me to be here with you and with representatives of Boitempo as well. This book, Limits to Capital, was written in the 1970s. Some people have complained to me that it's a little hard to read. My reply to that is, you should try writing it. And it took me nearly 10 years to write. So there are two questions here that I think are important. Why did I write it? And the question is, why would a book that was written in the 1970s be so relevant today? I wrote it because in the late 1960s, early 1970s, I was finding it very difficult to understand the world through contemporary social science. I had, in fact, worked with sociological understandings and economic understandings which were of a conventional sort, which backed up my interest in urbanization and urban planning. And I found this to be a very unsatisfactory framework for my understandings. So I was looking for something different. And I didn't turn to Marx because there was something in my genes that made me a Marxist, or something in my history that made me a Marxist. I turned to Marx out of curiosity in the first instance. And by then I was 35 years old, with an established career. And so I thought, well, let me read this book and see if there's anything interesting in it. And of course I found it extremely difficult to understand, except some ideas in it came over as being very simple. And so I got into what might be called my Marx project, which is to try to understand Marx and make it comprehensible, not just simply for political reasons, but to make it comprehensible in a way that would help me understand urbanization and urban processes. In 1970, I had just moved to the city of Baltimore in the United States from Britain, and I arrived in Baltimore 2 years or 1 year after the city had gone through a major uprising. Some people called it a riot, some people an uprising, when considerable parts of the city had been burned down as part of a protest. This was the end of a decade which became known as a decade of urban crisis. Now, the urban crisis in the United States of the 1960s was not a total crisis of urbanization. It was a crisis which was located in the inner cities, and the inner cities generally held low-income populations, typically racially marginalized, and at a time when the civil rights struggle was developing very fast. So the central cities became flashpoints for uprisings. So when you go through the 1960s, in 1963, 65, Los Angeles, the part of Los Angeles called Watts, erupted. Detroit erupted. Many cities underwent violent confrontations, and in many instances there were burnings and there were deaths, fights in the streets. And so there emerged a concern on the part of the federal government to do something about, quote, the urban crisis. And there were many reports that were issued, and a lot of money was put into research into what to do about the urban crisis. And as a result of that, I landed in Baltimore in the midst of a project in the university to try to understand the urban crisis, and in particular, the problem of housing in Baltimore. So my first 2 years in Baltimore were taken up with investigations of the urban situation and the roots of the urban discontent, as that discontent had developed during the 1960s. As part of this project, we had to collaborate with financial institutions, with government officials, federal, state, local, with real estate interests, with landlords, with pretty much, and community groups, pretty much everybody who was involved in the housing question. And we had to write a report on what to do about the housing question with all of those people being consulted. Since it turned out that I was one of the few people who really knew how to write in a simple kind of way, I ended up having to write the report, and I therefore had the opportunity to frame the report conceptually in any way I wanted. And it so happened when I was writing the report that I had just read the first chapter of Marx's Capital. And in the first chapter of Marx's Capital, there appears a distinction about the commodity, which is a distinction between use values and exchange values. And you can look upon a house, of course, as having a use value. We live in it. We do all kinds of things in our houses. But it's also an exchange value. And over time, it had become a peculiar kind of exchange value, because it was not only an exchange value for those people who produced it, it also turned into an exchange value for the people who lived in it. And that happened because in the 1930s, the United States had moved towards the idea of subsidizing home ownership for the population. And they subsidized home ownership in a number of ways. You got tax deductions for being a homeowner, and you got help with mortgage finance. And the help with mortgage finance was structured through the federal government, and financial institutions were encouraged to give you a 30-year mortgage on your house. And as a result of this, home ownership became part of what became called the American dream. Everybody will be a homeowner. Which meant that housing was a form of saving. And you therefore, as a saver, became very concerned with the value of your property. As a saver, you did not want people moving in next door who devalued your property. And the kind of people who devalued your property at that time were people of color, black people. So there was segregation in housing markets. White people tried to keep out black people from living in their neighborhood, because if black people lived in your neighborhood, the housing value went down. The result was that black people were forced to live in impacted areas of the city with relatively low housing values and very little housing opportunity. The exchange value system, in short, was operating in such a way as to reinforce segregation and to reinforce discrimination in housing markets. And this was therefore something where the contradiction between exchange and use value became central. So I decided that I would frame the whole report on housing around this conceptual distinction between use value and exchange value. We were sitting in a big room with the financiers, the bankers, and the real estate interests and the landlords and the like. And they'd all read the report, and one of the landlords said, "This is a great way to think about the housing question. This is a fantastic way." Okay. This is a great way to frame the housing question. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Here are these concepts on page 1 of volume 1 of Capital, which make sense. And everybody around the room said, this is a great way to look at the problem. And one of them said to me, "We thought you were an ordinary economist and were going to give us all of those demand and supply curves and things like that, which never work." So I felt very happy that this report was so well received and that it was founded on the principles laid out on page 1 of volume 1 of Capital. Of course, I didn't tell anybody where it came from, but what this convinced me was that it may be a good idea to go on to page 2.